Horus was more than just a god. He was a symbol of Egypt. His image was the emblem used by the first and all later pharaohs during over 3,000 years of Egyptian history. For some, he was the child of the sun. For others, the son of the Nile and the fertile soil of Egypt. He reigned over the sky and over the throne of the pharaohs. He symbolized the great heritage of divine kingship and stood guard over the cosmic harmony, moral and political order. Horus was Egypt. Hello everyone, my name's Irena. Welcome to my channel, Ancient Science Girl. I invite you to a podcast about the history of ancient Egypt. Today I want to introduce you to, or rather tell you more, about one of the most famous Egyptian gods, Horus. We will learn about his origins, his cult, and the incredible mythological struggle that eventually led to his ascension to the throne. Horus is the Greek name of this Egyptian god. The Egyptians called him Heru, sometimes Hor or Har, which meant the distant one. The word Her means upon or above. His name was probably known already in the pre-dynastic period. It referred to both the animal that symbolized him, the falcon, as well as to the sun and the moon, also associated with him. In pre- and early dynastic iconography, he accompanied military scenes. It seems that he was the god of war, and certainly the protector and patron of the constantly waging wars kings of Upper Egypt, who most likely originally ruled over the nomes from Hierakonpolis to Thinis, at a time when nomes were still independent city-states. With the victorious march of the Horus worshippers, armies under Narmer, the unifier of Egypt, around the 32nd century BC, the cult of Horus expanded, replacing the local deities it encountered, often other falcon gods with similar names. Horus soon became the first Egyptian national deity. For hundreds of years his cult has evolved, enriched with new mythological themes, which I will try to discuss in this podcast using the original sources. Horus myths can seem confusing and incoherent. They were created at different periods over 3,000 years and represent various theologies and local traditions. Horus was not subjected to time and space. His different forms sometimes appear in one myth. We've got to remember that this is a characteristic of Egyptian religion. Deities can be multidimensional and multifaceted. The popular cult of Horus influenced the perception of other Egyptian gods. For example, with the flourishing of the solar cult in the Old Kingdom, the image of the god Ra as a falcon with a solar disk above his head, Ra Horakhti, dominated. Similarly confusing can be the solar cult of Hore-Makhet, Horus on the horizon, representing the dawn and early morning sun. In the Old Kingdom depicted as a human-headed lion. According to some researchers, this form of Horus was to be the inspiration for the construction of the Great Sphinx in Giza. Also confusing might be the cult of Horus the Elder, son of Nut and Geb according to some and Hathor and Ra according to other sources. He is sometimes described as the consort of Isis, who in the Osirian tradition was his mother. According to the tradition of the Middle Kingdom, known from the coffin texts, the children of Isis and Horus were 4 deities protecting the organs of the dead, which were stored in canopic jars: Tuamutef, Imseti, Hapi, and Quebesenwef. In our consciousness, however, the representation of Horus from the Osirian myth prevails, where he is a key figure. The myth was included already in the pyramid texts from the late Old Kingdom, when the cult of Osiris spread throughout Egypt and dominated Egyptian religion. Although Horus's most famous sanctuary was in Edfu, his original, truly primeval cult center was Nekhen, better known by its Greek name, Hierakonpolis, City of the Hawk, located about 20 kilometers northwest of Edfu. There are many indications that it was the main political and religious center of pre-dynastic Upper Egypt, perhaps the capital of the first pharaohs even before Thinis. It is here that the famous Narmer Palette was found at the end of the 19th century, as well as many pre-dynastic and early dynastic artifacts. It was in Nekhen that the oldest tomb in Egypt, covered with paintings on plastered walls, was discovered. The so-called Tomb 100 comes from the Chalcolithic or Copper Age, which is a transitional period between the Neolithic and the Early Bronze Age. It belongs to the Nakada II culture, circa 3500 to 3200 BC, and already contains representations of gods, barks, and animals characteristic of the later Egyptian civilization. Among the most important discoveries of Hierakonpolis is the pre-dynastic temple of Horus, the oldest known Egyptian temple, also dated to Nakada II. It consisted of a large oval courtyard, 30 by 13 meters, surrounded by a reed fence which was plastered with mud. In the courtyard stood a tall wooden pillar, probably topped by a statue of a falcon. 4 tall pillars of Lebanese cedar, 1 meter thick, supported the facade of the temple. The sanctuary consisted of 3 main rooms, made of wooden poles and reed mats. It looked more like a large tent than the later mud brick temples. Most likely, animal sacrifices were made in the temple courtyard in the presence of the ruler. Probably there was also a large mound representing the primeval land, Benben, which emerged as the first of the mythical waters of chaos, Nun. The figurines of falcons from the Old Kingdom, found in the temple precinct, indicate that the place was surrounded by cult constantly. Just nearby, Hatshepsut erected her own edifice, and until the middle of the 19th century AD, the Greco-Roman temple of Horus stood here. Among the remains of the temple in its so-called main deposit, the famous scorpion mace head was also discovered, beautifully decorated with depictions of King Scorpion II from the so-called Dynasty 0 around 3200 to 3000 BC. Already in the earliest times, the prehistory of Egypt, the king was associated with Horus. Pre-dynastic and early dynastic artifacts found by archaeologists lead us to this view. Among other titles, the first kings were called the Living, which may have symbolized their role as intermediary between the gods and the mortals, the earth and heaven. It might have been the reason why the falcon was chosen for a royal symbol. Probably the ability to rise into the air was considered a divine and magical attribute. tamed falcons stayed among people, but at any moment they could fly up to the sky. They existed as it were in two different worlds, heaven and earth, which is a perfect metaphor illustrating the aforementioned feature attributed to the pharaohs. Almost consistently for 3,000 years, Horus was worshipped in the form of a falcon. On the famous Palette of Narmer, the founder of the First Dynasty and the unifier of Egypt more than 5,000 years ago, we see the image of Horus, a bird standing on a set of papyrus flowers symbolizing northern Egypt, over which Narmer gained control. The falcon wields a rope attached to the nose of the prisoner of war. On the palette we see a procession of Narmer's soldiers holding high standards with ancient symbols such as animal skin, a dog or jackal, and two falcons. The symbol of the falcon also appears above a group of decapitated prisoners. We can say with certainty that the falcon was a symbol of power in pre-dynastic Egypt, both religiously and militarily. One of the oldest Egyptian gods, the Lord of the Sky, Her-Ur or Herver, the Son of Truth, upholding Maat. His face was visualized as the face of the sun. According to some scholars, the word Heru means face and Herut means sky. The primeval god of the sun and sky took over the features of local deities of the prehistoric capital of Upper Egypt, Nekhen, such as the falcon god Nekhene, the Nekhenite, becoming the Horus of Nekhen. It's in this form that he will be worshipped until late antiquity. His most famous title, the Distant One, supposedly originated from the Egyptian word Her, meaning the one on high. We don't know whether it referred to his falcon form or to the sun, which according to the oldest traditions was his right eye. His left eye was the moon, hence his other name, Hor-Merti, Horus of the two eyes. Omnipresent in Egyptian art, Horus is depicted as a falcon or a falcon-headed pharaoh, most often with the double crown of Egypt, Pshent, symbolizing the unity of the kingdom, and often with a was scepter in the hand, as well as other pharaonic attributes. Horus was also symbolized by the winged sun disk and the Eye of Horus, a powerful and popular protective talisman among the Egyptians. The Eye of Horus was called the left eye of Wadjet, the serpent goddess, patroness and symbol of Upper Egypt. Her right eye was the Eye of Ra, which was the mirror image of the Eye of Horus. This is how Plutarch in the 2nd century AD described the cult of Hor-Merti among the Egyptians. In the sacred hymns of Osiris, they call upon him who is hidden in the arms of the sun, and on the 30th of the month Epipai, they celebrate the birthday of the eyes of Horus, at the time when the moon and the sun are in a perfectly straight line, since they regard not only the moon, but also the sun as the eye and light of Horus. We learn invaluable information about Horus by studying the numerous texts describing the Osirian myth, one of the central myths of ancient Egypt. Due to the multitude of ancient records, it is the most popular one. As we know, Osiris was the first king of Egypt, good and just. He civilized the peoples he ruled over. His brother Seth usurped the crown by murdering Osiris, who he deceitfully locked in a wooden sarcophagus and threw into the Nile, where Osiris drowned. Of course, there are many versions of these events, but this one is the most famous. The myth describes the further fate of the remains of Osiris hidden from Seth, who desecrated them twice, including dismembering Osiris and scattering his remains all over Egypt. The history of Osiris remains, as well as Isis' epic journey to find them, although fascinating, is a topic for another podcast. We will focus today on the story of Horus. When Isis finally found the dismembered body of Osiris, she and Seth's righteous wife Nephthys restored it with the help of the first embalmer Anubis and Thoth, who had great magical powers. When Osiris became the first mummy, Isis blew her life-giving breath into him, brought the dead body of the god to life, and then magically conceived with him a son, a rightful heir, the savior who would restore Maat on earth and in the universe, the divine order of the first time Sep-Tepi, the same one that disturbed Seth and his minions. And Osiris, the ruler of the land of the dead, Duat, will be reborn on earth in the form of his son. We get to know the fascinating details of the story from the so-called Metternich stele from the time of Nectanebo II, the 30th dynasty. After killing Osiris, Seth was convinced he would finally take over the world of the living. Osiris was then the king of the dead and the underworld. Seth, however, didn't expect that Isis was pregnant with the child of Osiris, who, due to his birthright, was the rightful heir to the throne. Isis fled to the swamps, trying to hide from Seth. There, in isolation in the wilderness, exposed to the attacks of wild animals, including poisonous scorpions, she gave birth to Horus. When Seth learned of the birth of Horus, he ordered the scorpion to poison the child, who died after being stung. In despair, Isis summons Ra, asking him for help. Moved, Ra sides with Horus and sends Thoth to use powerful magic to bring the child back to life. The so-called story about Isis and the 7 scorpions carved out on the stele contains Thoth's healing words. Call, let the child live and the venom die. As Horus will be cured for his mother Isis, so will those who suffer. This is a compress made of spelled bread, which effectively exorcises the venom. This is natron and burning garlic extract that exorcise flames from limbs. Steles, popular in Egypt, describing a sick Horus child, used a religious theme to convey medical and magical knowledge about the treatment of various ailments. Their makers creatively developed the themes of the myth, describing, among others, healing the divine child of fever, abdominal pain, snake bites, and scorpion stings, which must have been common among the ancient Egyptians. Horus was revived by the gods who favored him and remained under the care of his mother, hidden in the papyrus thicket of the Nile Delta. The child was born in the period of darkness. The throne is occupied by Seth, associated with chaos, disaster, and infertility. Hence, other gods sided with Horus, who embodied the chance for a new beginning and the restoration of order in the world. We owe the most complete description of the myth to the Greek historian and philosopher Plutarch, who, based on Egyptian sources, wrote on Isis and Osiris in the 2nd century AD. It's part of his larger work, Moralia. Although, according to many, Plutarch slightly distorted the image of the myth, he clearly didn't understand many elements of the Egyptian religion, reaching, for example, for elements from Greek mythology. He left us with a priceless, complete description of this most famous and influential story in Egyptian mythology. Plutarch describes the origin of Horus. They relate, moreover, that Nephthys became the wife of Typhon. Here Plutarch means Seth. But Isis and Osiris were enamored of each other and consulted together in the darkness of the womb before their birth. Some say that Arweris came from this union and was called the elder Horus by the Egyptians, but Apollo by the Greeks. Interestingly, in Plutarch's myth there are two Horuses. The first, an adult, whom he calls Horus the Elder, born before the death of Osiris. The second one is Harpocrates, Horus the Younger, surrounded by a special cult in Ptolemaic Egypt, born of the posthumous union of Osiris with Isis. According to Plutarch, Harpocrates is a premature and weak child. Quote, Osiris consorted with Isis after his death, and she became the mother of Harpocrates, untimely born and weak in his lower limbs. This version, however, is not confirmed in pharaonic sources. Moreover, the famous motif of the missing member of Osiris being eaten by a fish also occurs exclusively in Plutarch. And only Plutarch describes how the heroes of the Osirian myth actually looked like. Quote, the Egyptians in fact have a tradition that Hermes, here he means Thoth, had thin arms and big elbows, that Typhon, Seth, was red in complexion, Horus white and Osiris dark, as if they had been in their nature but mortal men. The part of the myth of Horus with the child sheltered by Isis was immortalized in countless carved images of the goddess nursing Horus. Sitting on his mother's lap, little Horus has the characteristic side lock of youth, also called the Horus lock. It symbolized in ancient Egypt, already in the Old Kingdom, the rightful successor of Osiris. Horus the Younger, usually shown with a finger in his mouth. This image was given to Harpocrates, worshipped in Ptolemaic and Roman times. The image of Isis nursing Horus was widespread throughout the Roman world from the time the cult of Isis grew in popularity up until late antiquity. A view quite popular today among researchers sees in this image the archetype of the Christian motif of the Madonna with the baby Jesus. The next part of the myth is a series of struggles, often bloody, between Horus and Seth for the throne of Osiris. His late father was supposed to prepare Horus for the epic fight. Plutarch writes, later, as they relate, Osiris came to Horus from the other world and exercised and trained him for the battle. After a time, Osiris asked Horus what he held to be the most noble of all things, when Horus replied, to avenge one's father and mother for evil done to them. The conflict between Horus and Seth is commonly interpreted as an echo of the early dynastic divisions in Egypt, or a conflict between the north and the south that preceded the country's unification. As we know, the rulers of Upper Egypt called themselves followers of Horus, but the ancient centers of the cult of Horus were also located in the north of the country. A more likely version, therefore, seems to be a conflict from early dynastic times between Nekhen, the prehistoric center of the Horus cult I discussed earlier, and Nakada in central Egypt, where Seth was worshipped. According to some scholars, the civil war between the followers of Seth and Horus was supposed to have taken place during the Second Dynasty, around the 29th to the 27th century BC. A king of the Second Dynasty, named Seth Peribsen, used the animal of Seth to write his Serek name in place of the traditional image of a falcon. Did he lead the forces of Seth worshippers before he took power? His successor, the last ruler of the Second Dynasty and the early dynastic period, also known as the Thinit period, named Kasekemwe, included Horus's name. The two powers appear in his title, which is interpreted as a conciliatory, symbolic recognition of the two gods as patrons of the kingdom. In one of the battles for the throne of Osiris, Seth was supposed to deprive Horus of his eyes, a theme that seems to be extremely often used in the pyramid texts. The oldest of them, and in fact the oldest religious text of Egypt in general, is found in the Pyramid of Unas, the last ruler of the 5th dynasty from the 24th century BC. There we will find whole litanies to the eye of Horus. Osiris Unis, accept little Horus's eye, of which Seth has eaten. Osiris Unis, accept Horus's eye, which Seth trampled. Osiris Unis, accept Horus's eye, which he took from Seth. And in the Book of the Dead we read, "It was the combat which took place on that day when Horus fought with Seth, during which Seth threw filth in the face of Horus, and Horus crushed the genitals of Seth." Removal of the eye of Horus could be equated with an eclipse of the sun and moon. It wasn't a simple mutilation of the opponent, but in this case a terrible sin against the work of creation, an iconoclastic act. Since the sun and the moon were considered the eyes of Horus, it was the dimly shining moon that ancient Egyptians considered dismembered by Seth. The mutilated eye was restored by Thoth, the moon god. This is one of the deities that during the conflict with Seth always supported Horus, as well as Isis, Anubis, Nephthys, and of course Hathor, considered to be the wife of Horus. During the wars between Horus and Seth, a special episode concerns the time when the fighting temporarily ceased, and both gods decided to resolve their conflict in court by raising their case before the Ennead. Their court dispute was described in a 20th dynasty papyrus as the contendings of Horus and Seth. It's one of a collection called the Chester Beatty Papyri. The gods settling the dispute between Horus and Seth are usually the Ennead, a group of 9 oldest gods who were present at the act of creation. Its members, of course, vary according to regional theologies and sources. As aforementioned, Thoth, the god of wisdom and justice, is definitely on the side of Horus, presenting evidence against Seth. Shu also sided with the son of Osiris. In response, Seth defiantly rejects their decisions, calling Horus to fight. "Have him dismissed outside with me, that I may let you see my hands prevail over his hands in the presence of the Ennead, since there is not known any other method of dispossessing him." To which Thoth replies, "Shouldn't we ascertain who is the impostor? It's while Osiris's son, Horus, is still living that his office is to be awarded to Seth." The chief of the tribunal, Ra-Horakhti, embodying Atum, expresses favor with Seth. Quote, "Ra-Horakhti became exceedingly furious, for his wish was to give the office to Seth, great in virility, the son of Nut." Then Ra-Horakhti invites another god to settle the dispute, the warrior mother goddess Neith, who unexpectedly agrees with Horus. Quote, "Then Neith the Great sent a letter to the Ennead, saying, 'Award the office of Osiris to his son Horus. Don't commit such blatant acts of iniquity which are illegal, or I shall become so furious that the sky will touch the ground. The universal lord, the bull who resides in Heliopolis, ought to be told. Enrich Seth in his possessions, give him Anath and Astarte, your 2 daughters, and install Horus in the position of his father Osiris.'" Interestingly, we learn from this quote that Neith is in charge of the fate of foreign Phoenician goddesses. Let me remind you that this is a text from the New Kingdom, not from the Greco-Roman period, when the merging of different foreign religious systems was happening on a daily basis. "This goddess is correct," the tribunal said. "The Lord of all, Ra, dissatisfied with the course of the case, insults Horus. You are despicable in your person, and this office is too much for you, you lad, the flavor of whose mouth is still bad. Ra is the only one who still favors Seth. The rest of the Ennead leaves the court shouting, 'Get out! This offense that you have committed is exceedingly great.'" On the next day of the trial, Seth says, "As for me, I am Seth, greatest in virility among the Ennead, for I slay the opponent of Ra daily, while I am at the prow of the bark of the millions, whereas not any other god is able to do it. I should receive the office of Osiris." Now it seems clear why Ra defends Seth. He protects the sun god against demons during his nocturnal journey through the underworld. Is it while a bodily son is still living that the office is to be awarded to a maternal uncle? Protested Thoth and Anhur, also known as Onuris, god of war worshipped in Abydos. Some of the deities, however, began to join Seth, to which Isis expressed her dissatisfaction. Quote, "Thereupon Isis became furious at the Ennead and took an oath by the god in the presence of the Ennead as follows: 'By Mother Neith, the goddess, and by Ptah Tatanen with lofty plumes, who curbs the horns of gods, these matters should be submitted before Atum, the great prince who is in Heliopolis.' And the Ennead said to her, 'Don't become angry. The rights will be given to the one who is in the right. All that you have said will be done.'" The inconsistency of the members of the divine tribunal also angered Seth, who resorted to threats. "I shall take my scepter of 4,500 nemset weight and kill one of you a day." And then Seth took an oath by the universal Lord, saying, "I shall not go to law in the tribunal while Isis is still in it." Said Ra-Horakhti to them, "You shall ferry across to the island in the middle and decide between them there, and tell Nemti, the ferryman, not to ferry any woman across resembling Isis." However, Isis got to the island disguised as an old woman by bribing a ferryman, and then she turned into the most beautiful girl in Egypt, who complained to Seth that after her husband's death in her village, a stranger had taken over her cow's herd, although her son was alive. Enchanted Seth granted her son the right to keep the herd, which discredited himself in the eyes of the Ennead. Seth's last chance is a challenge to Horus, a contest where the throne of Osiris is at stake. Ra agreed, and the rivals in the form of hippopotami fought underwater for 3 months. During the fight, Isis, who constantly helps her son, took pity on her brother, to which Horus reacted in a terrifying way. Quote, Horus, son of Isis, became furious at his mother Isis and went out with his face as fierce as an upper Egyptian panther's, having his cleaver of 15 Theban weight in his hand. He removed the head of his mother Isis, put it in his arms, and ascended the mountain. Then Isis transformed herself into a statue of flint with no head. Let us remember that in Egyptian mythology, we do not find a flawless hero. It was a culture completely different than ours, which is presented in this story. The personification of the highest authority, the god, the pharaoh, commits terrible acts out of passion. But soon he paid for his crimes. Quote, "Let us go and inflict severe punishment upon him," exclaimed Ra. The story continues. Quote, "Now as for Horus, he was lying under a shanusha tree in the land of the oasis. Seth found him, seized hold of him, threw him down upon his back on the mountain, removed his 2 eyes from their sockets, and buried them on the mountain so as to illuminate the earth. The 2 balls of his eyes became 2 bulbs, which grew into lotuses. Seth came away and told Rahorachti falsely, 'I did not find Horus,' although he had found him." Lying in the desert and crying, Horus was found by the goddess Hathor, who healed his eyes by washing them with gazelle milk. Then Seth and Horus once again stood before the Ennead, where they heard from Ra. "Go and obey what I tell you. You should eat and drink so that we may have some peace. Stop quarreling so every day on end." Now the story gets really awkward. Seth invited Horus to his home for dinner to settle the conflict. Here's what happened next. Quote, "Now afterward at evening time, bed was prepared for them, and they both lay down. But during the night," unquote, Seth tried to seduce Horus, but Horus outwitted him, or as other sources claim, Seth missed his mark, and Horus caught his seed into his hands placed between the thighs. Horus went to tell his mother Isis, "Help me, Isis, my mother, come and see what Seth has done to me." And he opened his hands and let her see Seth's seed. She let out a loud shriek, seized the copper knife, and cut off his hands. Clever Isis added the seed of Horus to the lettuce that Seth ate regularly. At the next trial before the tribunal, Seth announced to all the gods, quote, "Let me be awarded the office of ruler, for as to Horus, the one who is standing trial, I have performed the labor of a male against him." The Ennead let out a loud cry. They spewed and spat at Horus's face. Horus laughed at them. Horus then took an oath by God as follows: "All that Seth has said is false. Let Seth's seed be summoned that we may see from where it answers, and my own be summoned, that we may see from where it answers. Then Thoth, lord of script and scribe of truth for the Ennead, put his hand on Horus's shoulder and said, "Come out, you seed of Seth," and it answered him from the water in the interior of the marsh. Thoth put his hand on Seth's shoulder and said, "Come out, you seed of Horus." The seed appeared as a golden sun disk on Seth's head, and the tribunal decided that Horus was telling the truth. Furious, Seth announced that he would not give up the crown unless his nephew beat him in a rowing competition on stone ships. Of course, it came to the races. The clever Horus prepared for himself a wooden boat plastered over with gypsum so that it looked like a stone one. Obviously, the stone boat of Seth sank, but as we could have expected, Seth didn't let go and, in the form of a hippopotamus, attacked Horus, who defended himself with a harpoon. The Ennead saved Seth by calling out to Horus, "Don't hurl it at him." According to the source, this was in the 80th year of the trial before the tribunal. As you can see, the divine courts proceeded rather slowly. After Osiris' letters sent from the land of the dead and Horus's last fight with Seth, Seth finally considered himself defeated and gave Horus his rightful place on the throne of Osiris. Then Isis, whose struggle lasted much longer than Horus's, joyfully speaks to her son. "You are the good king. My heart is in you. You have illuminated the earth with your complexion." The gods of the great Ennead rejoiced with the whole country that Horus has arisen as ruler. After the final victory, Horus decided not to annihilate Seth, as Plutarch wrote. But this Horus is himself perfected and complete, but he has not done away completely with Typhon, but has taken away his activity and strength. Hence they say that at Copto, the statue of Horus holds in one hand the privy members of Typhon, and they relate a legend that Hermes cut off the sinews of Typhon and used them as strings for his lyre, thereby instructing us that reason adjusts the universe and creates concord out of discordant elements, and that it does not destroy but only cripples the destructive force. Seth, on the other hand, was given a new role by Ra. Quote, "Let Seth, son of Nut, be delivered to me so that he may dwell with me, being in my company as a son, and he shall thunder in the sky and be feared." The victory over Seth was celebrated by the Egyptians in the great mass event of the Osiris Mysteries at Abydos, a religious festival that drew thousands of worshippers from all over the country, during which Horus' fight with Seth was publicly reenacted. This event is described on the stele of Ikher-Nofret. He was the treasurer of Senusret III of the 12th dynasty, the Middle Kingdom period. The festival was celebrated in the holy city of the Thinite nome, Abydos, where apart from the great sanctuary of Osiris, there was a necropolis of the first kings of the Thinite period. It was there, near the tombs of Scorpion, Narmer, or Kasekemwe, that the tomb of Osiris himself was supposed to be located. The Egyptians probably believed that Osiris owned the tomb known today as Jer's tomb, belonging to the third ruler of the first dynasty. The festival began with the exit of Osiris in front of the temple, where before the crowds of believers the god was attacked by Seth and murdered. This was followed by the ceremony of the going forth of Webwawet, the dog-headed god of war, who personified Horus, proceeding to avenge his father. In a great procession, the crowds followed the bark with the statue of Osiris towards his tomb. Then the role of Samer-F, his beloved son, Horus, was played. He performed funeral ceremonies over his deceased father to be crowned by the prophet of Herandotis, the high priest of Horus. The name Herandotis, Egyptian Hornet-Jitef, means Horus who protects his father. Apart from the dog-headed Webwawet opening the festival, all the roles of Horus were to be played by the pharaoh himself, always present during the festival along with his royal retinue. Only the pharaoh in the presence of the highest priests could approach the tomb of Osiris. Interestingly, it seems that in Abydos, Horus fulfills the roles attributed in Osirian myths to Isis and Anubis, absent at the festival. Despite so many intimate details from the life of Horus that are contained in the myths, he remained for the Egyptians a distant deity, directly associated with the power of the pharaoh, a ruler distant from his subjects, a living god whose even accidental touch by a subject meant a death sentence, as it was in the Old Kingdom. Thus, Horus was not an accessible god, worshipped at home, a folk deity, but rather a distant god of heaven, embodying all the virtues of the protector of Mad, symbolizing the majesty of the king and the state. It was widely believed in Egypt that a new pharaoh ascending the throne, like Horus once did, would restore Mad, balance and order in the universe. It's thanks to the pharaoh, the reincarnation of Horus, that the vulnerable architecture of the universe resists the flooding of Nun, endless cosmic chaos. The office of pharaoh was not considered a human model of power. It had a deeply religious meaning. The kingship was preserved in Horus. Only he can sit on the throne. The Horus name is the ancient crest of the first Egyptian kings. Almost every early dynastic ruler placed a falcon symbolizing Horus on his serek, the prototype of later cartouches. It was a rectangular vignette containing the image of a protective deity and a graphic representation of the facade of the royal palace. The word serek itself means facade. Early Egyptian rulers recognized Horus as the patron of their dynasties. In a few cases, it was said. The Horus name is part of the royal titulary of later pharaohs, which included the divine or spiritual names of the patrons chosen by the newly crowned rulers, as well as a reference to the term two lands. For example, the title of Pepi I, 6th dynasty, is King of Upper and Lower Egypt, favorite of two goddesses, Merikhet, Merire, Pepi I, and the name of Horus is Beloved of the Two Lands. The Horus name of Thutmose III of the 18th dynasty is Horus Mighty Bull, risen in Thebes. The Mighty Bull as the title of Horus appears often, sometimes in combination with the adjective grassland, and might be a relic of prehistory, as it refers to the pastoral past of the founders of the first nomes or city-states, and the then different climate that prevailed in Egypt, but that's just my guess. Another of the 5 names of the pharaohs, directly referring to Horus, is the golden falcon name, added to the title in the time of the Second Dynasty. It was symbolized by the motif of a falcon over the gold sign, probably symbolizing the victory of Horus's followers over northern Egypt, over the Seth's followers. There were also 2 ladies' names as well as birth name and throne name. During the Ptolemaic period of the 4th to the 1st century BC, there was a profound cultural transition. Social changes and innovations were taking place in weakened by hundreds of years of foreign rules and wars Egypt. However, religious institutions remained intact. Temples were still erected in the indigenous pharaonic style. Religions have rarely succumbed to foreign influence. The country's political and economic revival is marked by new grand construction projects, such as the Great Temple of Horus in Edfu, which was begun in the 3rd century BC under Ptolemy III, to replace an old Ramessidic temple. It is the largest temple in Egypt dedicated to Horus, located in Upper Egypt between Esna and Aswan. According to local religious tradition, at the beginning of the world, when the primeval land emerged from the water, it was in the place where the first reeds became the nest of Horus the falcon that the temple was built thousands of years later. The original theology of Edfu, as we know, generally each region had its own, is that the falcon formed the sky dome there, and its wings stretched from horizon to horizon. The first temple was supposedly designed by the gods Thoth and Seshat, the goddess of writing and knowledge, female scribe, and it was built of reeds. To protect the temple, 60 gods formed a living wall around it. The ancients called Edfu Behdet, and Horus of Baghdad was the god of the midday sun. Like Ra, Horus of Edfu was in constant battle with the powers of darkness, so that the sun could rise in the morning. Of course, it was Seth who represented the enemies of the sun in Edfu theology. Horus Baghdadi's symbol was a winged sun disk placed on temples all over the country. He was also depicted as a lion with the head of a falcon. According to local myth, Seth conspired against Ra during his earthly reign. Ra sent his son Horus, who in the form of a solar disk defeated the enemies, for which he received the city of Edfu as a reward. As the solar disk, Horus settled on the prow of the solar bark to protect Ra. Hence, Egyptian sailors believed that they were protected by Horus, and the eye of Horus was painted on the prows of boats. The temple was one of the most important Ptolemaic religious centers. Besides Horus, it was also dedicated to Hathor, whose sacred bark traveled south every year from her temple in Dendera to visit Horus, her husband. Their reunion in Edfu was a great event, a religious festival attracting crowds of pilgrims. An important event was the annual coronation ritual of a living falcon, described in detail in temple inscriptions. The coronation of a live sacred bird was intended to renew the royal power, but it's worth mentioning that without the king's participation in the ceremony. This illustrates the approach of the Egyptians to the kingdom later in their history. Divine kingship Horus takes the role of a living falcon, not a physical ruler in Alexandria. His presence is not necessary. The role of the king comes down only to providing means for the temple cult, Pharaoh no longer plays the central part of Horus worship. This ceremony was written by the priests deliberately omitting the ruler. Perhaps it was an expression of Atfus' opposition to the Hellenization of the Egyptians, the promotion of new cults in Alexandria, such as the cult of Serapis, which led to the marginalization of traditional religious centers and the loss of indigenous culture and identity. However, it should be remembered that this great temple was built by the Ptolemies, like the one in Komombo dedicated to Horus the Elder and Sobek. It was during these times that sanctuaries of the Egyptian gods were built on a scale not known since the time of the Ramessids, and the cult of Horus, both as part of the then popular great religion of Isis and the new cult of Horus' child Harpocrates, extended far beyond the borders of Egypt. I hope you learned something new about Horus. Thank you for listening. Please let me know in the comments what you would like to hear about next time. Don't forget to like my video and subscribe to my channel. Goodbye, and see you on the next one.